I've had a complicated relationship with Terramaster in the past. In fact, the last Terramaster video I did, I spent the entire video calling the product the wrong model number, and then I shit all over it because I was unimpressed with its performance. So imagine my surprise when Terramaster sent over their new F4-424 Max 4-bay NAS. Is it any good? Let's check it out. Hey there, HomeLabbers, self-hosters, IT pros, and engineers. Rich here. Terramaster builds the F4-424 Max as a high-performance 4-bay NAS designed for small and medium businesses, and they've packed some pretty impressive hardware that we've not yet seen from them in a NAS this size. Terramaster claims the unit excels in virtualization, multimedia streaming, and cross-platform file services, which we plan to evaluate. In this video, we'll be putting the F4-424 Max through its paces, and I'll give you my final thoughts at the end. One last thing, this video is not sponsored. However, Terramaster did send us the unit with drives for free. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. Let's get the external features and outside dimensions out of the way first. The Terramaster F4-424 Max measures in at 222mm high by 179mm wide by 154mm deep. The all-plastic exterior has a slight texture and feels, well, like injection molded plastic. Up front, we have the 4 3.5-inch hot swappable drive bays, and on the right, 5 total LED indicator lights, 1 for power and 4 for the discs. Around both sides of the unit, we have rather large Terramaster logos that double as ventilation openings for the unit. And lastly, the back of the unit. The F4-424 Max features a large single 140mm exhaust fan that dominates most of the rear of the unit. Having a 140mm fan means quieter operations and better airflow. On the left side of the rear, we have all of our connectivity. Starting at the top, we have the single power button for the unit, followed by an HDMI port, 2 10GB Ethernet ports, you heard me right, 2 10GB Ethernet ports, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A ports, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port, and a barrel connector for power. The F4-424 Max goes for $900 US without drives on Amazon. Back to the network connectivity, you heard me right, the F4-424 Max has 2 10GB copper Ethernet ports, which was quite a surprise when I pulled the thing out of the box. I expected 2.5GB, but the 10GB ports were a very nice surprise. Let's crack this unit open now and take a look at the internals and talk about the specs. Opening up the unit is done by freeing the 2 Phillips screws on the back and shifting the right side forward to expose the main board in the unit. The F4-424 Max is rocking an Intel Core i5-1235U CPU with 10 total cores, 2 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, has a max turbo boost of 4.4 GHz for the performance cores, and has a base power of 15 watts that can boost up to 55 watts. The unit comes standard with 8GB of DDR5 RAM, provides a second SODIMM slot, and is upgradable to 64GB of total memory. The F4-424 Max also features 2 2280 M.2 NVMe slots on board for additional storage or caching. We've seen this same board layout from Terramaster in the past. Pulling the 4 mounting screws, tilting up and lifting out, we can easily free the board from the unit. On the back side of the board, we find an absolutely massive passive heatsink, keeping the i5-1235U cool, which is good because in this location, there doesn't look to be as much cross ventilation to keep the CPU cool. The board also features a 4x PCIe slot that connects the 4 SATA disks to the motherboard. The expansion board does look to have some logic on it, so it's likely that there's a SATA controller embedded in it. The last thing of note is the onboard USB 2.0 connector and the small thumb drive inserted. Like in previous Terramaster NASes, this little guy here is the boot OS for TOS 6.0, Terramaster's NAS operating system. It's interesting that with all of the high-speed connectivity on this unit, they're still using USB 2.0 for the boot drive on the NAS. I'm sure they've done all the math in terms of what is necessary to boot the system, but it's funny to see that the slowest thing in the NAS is that boot drive. Just saying. Now let's move on. Let's get the NAS drive bays and the NVMe slots populated and boot the unit up for the first time. We'll be outfitting the F4-424 Max with 4 Western Digital 4TB Red Pro NAS drives and 2 1TB Kingston NVMe's. Let's get to it. Building out the mechanical disk caddies is a breeze on the F4-424 Max. The 3.5-inch disk caddies are completely toolless, and installing drives is super quick. Just pull the retaining strips from the side of the caddy, drop in your 3.5-inch mechanical drive of choice, replace the retaining strips, insert the drive in the NAS, and you're done. And yes, you can install 2.5-inch SSDs in the caddies as well using the included screws to do so. Likewise, installing the M.2 NVMe drives is simple as well. However, you do have to open the side panel to get to the M.2 slots on the board. Nothing a seasoned IT pro like yourself can't do in roughly 5 minutes max. All done, let's get the unit set up. Alright, now that we've got all of our storage installed and ready, let's run through the initial setup of the unit. To start the initial setup of the unit, we open our browser and head over to tnas.local, where we're greeted with the installation wizard for the F4-424 Max. Quick note here, if you're going to deploy this unit in a different subnet than your PC, then you're going to need to find out what its IP address is to connect to the setup site. The whole tnas.local thing is done via broadcast DNS, which requires you to be on the same subnet to resolve that name. Setup is straightforward. We click Start, and then we're asked if we want the unit to run its automatic initialization or cancel out of that and do it manually. I'm really curious as to how automagic their automatic installation will be, so let's have it do its thing here and we'll see what it comes up with. Along the way, it asked if we were cool with wiping disks, and then it went off and did the partitioning of the disks on its own. Next stop was for the unit to install the Terramaster OS known as TOS. The install process for the OS took roughly 3 minutes on the unit and followed up with the reboot of the box once completed. Next, we were hit with the EULA that we absolutely read, and then it was time to give this device a name and set the first user on the box. The system would not let me use the username admin, which shows at least some sensitivity to security and prevents commonly attacked names from being used on the NAS. This was followed up with a screen to set an email account for the newly created admin account. Oddly enough, the whole security email thing didn't work, so I skipped the process completely. After a bit of time, we land on the TOS web UI, and the software walks you through a quick tutorial. If you're a first-time user of Terramaster and TOS, running through it will help you get a good feel for their UI. The initial setup was quick and easy, so now let's see how that automatic installation process provisioned the storage. Spoiler alert, not great. Alright, let's take a look at the storage volume first. Looks like we have one volume, and its size is 12.69 terabytes. Over in Storage Pool, we have a single pool, also 12.69 terabytes in size, so it fully built out a single storage pool with all of the available space. Let's check out the disks next. And it's clear the F4-424 Max sees all of the mechanical hard drives and NVMe disks. I'm hoping that when I click on Hypercache that I'll see the 2 NVMe disks deployed within, and no NVMEs. So where are they? Back to Storage Pool, we'll expand Storage Pool 1 and what the hell? That's a first. It looks like the automatic deployment decided all disks are the same and combined them into a single pool. Well, that's a first. While I might not know what sort of black magic Terramaster's T-RAID is capable of, it can't possibly be a good idea to mix different types of disk speeds and sizes together, especially dramatically different types of disks like SATA hard disks and M.2 NVMe SSDs. It just feels like a dumb decision. I would assume that the correct deployment would have been to have either 2 storage pools with the same disk types, or the system would have been smart enough to build out disk caching with the NVMEs in a mirrored read-write configuration. Let's fix this abomination of a storage deployment and get to some storage performance testing. First thing we need to do is destroy the existing storage pool and re-provision it. We'll hit delete, give it my password, and confirm the deletion. This took a bit to complete. Now that we've erased the F4-424 Max's shameful past, we'll create a new storage pool by clicking Create, deselecting the NVMe drives, and then we'll choose our RAID type. You can see from the dropdown that you have a bunch of different array options like RAID 0, 1, 5, JBOD, and T-RAID and T-RAID Plus. The default option is T-RAID, and by the disk layout above, it's pretty clear that it mimics a typical RAID 5 array with a disk's worth of storage lost to parity. T-RAID Plus looks to be more in line with a RAID 10 deployment with 2 sets of mirrored disks, which nets you a 50% loss of storage. As an aside, look at this message. To ensure optimal stability of the storage pool and data security, do not mix USB external and local disks in the storage pool. I feel like this is yet another situation where Terramaster engineers were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Anyway, moving on. We're going to leave it default and let the chips fall where they may. And done. Now we need to create a volume to share out to the network for testing. Volume creation is just as simple. We only have one pool, and the volume name looks to be statically assigned as Volume 1. We'll leave the volume capacity set to max and click Next. I want to stop on this just for a moment because I think it's pretty fascinating. It looks like Terramaster has immutable storage functionality available in this unit, however it's not enableable here for some reason. Terramaster is calling it Hyperlock Worm, which is quite the name. If you live in the world of enterprise backup, you're already familiar with immutable storage, and I'm pretty surprised to see a feature like this in a Soho NAS. Anyway, moving on. After the summary, we'll hit Confirm to kick off the volume creation. I'm going to be doing something different in this video when it comes to the performance results. I'm just going to give you the bottom line results up front here, and if you really want to see the detailed results, let me know and I'll post them on the 2GT website. I tested the unit's SMB performance direct between a Windows 11 client and the NAS over 10 gig networking using Crystal Disk Mark. I tested 3 different deployment types here on the NAS, a single pool with only 4 hard disks, a single pool with the same 4 hard disks with Terramaster's hyper cache setup in read-write mode, and because I know you're going to ask, a straight NVMe pool to round out the 3 tests. Let's get to the benchmark results.
And here are the results of all 3. Remember, this is the average of all of the tests run. We'll look at real-life testing in a moment. First off, the hard disk only pool. The F4-424 Max averaged 643.92 megabytes a second read, with a write speed average of nearly 1 gigabyte a second. Pretty good for just a simple 4-bay mechanical disk pool. Next, the same pool with Terramaster's hypercache configured in read-write mode using the NVMe disks. Here we saw the average of all read tests jump up over 200 megabytes a second more, but had no benefit on the write tests as this little NAS was already pushing full 10 gigabit writes already. It's good to know that the cache does make a difference. And lastly, how did the F4-424 Max manage with just NVMe disks alone in a pool? And the short and should be obvious answer here was that it essentially saturated its 10 gig connection with over a gigabyte a second reading and writing to the NVMe disks. Gotta say guys, I'm pretty impressed.
There are devils in these details that you can't see when everything is averaged down to a single number here. I'm happy to provide all of the raw data on our website if you guys really want to see it, but showing it here would be an eye chart. As much as I like synthetic benchmarks though, they're not real life and you shouldn't trust that your experiences with any hardware will live up to that benchmark. So let's do some simple real life tests in Windows by copying files between the two.
Alright, let's do a real-time transfer of a single file just slightly over 6 gigs in size between a Windows 11 desktop on the left and the NAS on the right. And right away, we can see why we shouldn't trust synthetic benchmarks. You can immediately see that about a quarter of the time, we pushed a gigabyte a second because the data was flowing directly into cache on the unit. But once the cache was full, we see the real-life throughput performance realistically being around 300 megabytes a second, which makes sense if you consider that we're writing directly to mechanical disks in the unit. So that's uploading to the F4-424 Max. Let's run the real-life download and see how well it performs. And the short answer is it did quite well on the download test. There was a bit of a ramp up, but overall ending at right around a gigabyte a second throughput. Let's look at the same test with caching now. Same as before, Windows 11 system on the left, F4-424 Max on the right, and go. This time we really see the cache making a difference here. We were able to get nearly all the way through the copy job before the unit exhausted its cache and dropped down to roughly 500 megabytes a second. So caching does make a difference here it seems. And on the download side, we see essentially the same thing. Great download speed from the F4-424 Max until it gets towards the end and then drops down to roughly 600 megabytes a second. Finally, let's do this one more time with the pure NVMe only storage pool. Uploading the data to the NVMe storage flew by at full speed of the 10 gig connectivity, which one would hope to see when you're talking about both sides being NVMe storage and having direct 10 gig connectivity between them. So how did the real-life download from the F4-424 Max to the desktop do? Interestingly enough, downloading from the F4-424 Max came in around roughly 650 megabytes a second. I would have expected to see full throughput when downloading from the NAS when the backing storage is NVMe, but not so much.
This is what I meant by not fully trusting synthetic tests over real-life results. Synthetics are useful, but you should always remember that those tests are testing very specific transfer types, and your mileage may vary in real life. With performance testing out of the way, let's take a quick stroll through TOS 6, the UI on the F4-424 Max, and then we'll get to my final thoughts.
Once you've logged into the NAS, you'll land on the dashboard of TOS 6. At the top of the screen is your shortcut bar, where you'll find all of the apps for the NAS. The shortcuts provide you access to things like your user settings and power controls, a file manager to interact with your files, folders, and shares, a link to all of your installed apps, a shortcut to any number of native backup programs you can install on the NAS, the control panel where you essentially configure all aspects of the system, and a shortcut to the App Center of the NAS. And finally, a shortcut to their help and documentation. On the far right, we have some floating icons that give you access to desktop widgets, recent alerts on the NAS, a shortcut to mute the buzzer, and again, another help shortcut. TOS 6 has an app store with a fair bit of applications to install without having to get knee-deep into Docker, and has all the typical hits like Plex and others. While it's not as massive as other NAS software out there, it'll give people who don't want to get into containers access to deploy the things that they need. Speaking of Docker, and as I mentioned earlier, Terramaster natively supports Docker in TOS 6 via their installable Docker Manager app and Docker Engine. The Docker Manager app looks like it'll do the trick for getting containers up and running and managing them, but it feels a bit half-baked. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Terramaster knows that too, because they also provide an easy way to deploy Portainer on your NAS for container management. I respect the fact that they're giving you a choice on how you want to manage your container workloads, so good on them.
All right, let's talk about the good, bad, and ugly of the F4-424 Max. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I'm actually impressed by this NAS. What? Yep. You heard me right. Overall, this NAS does a pretty good job, and it should because, again, it is $900 without drives. The unit showed that it can, for the most part, saturate those 10 gig connections, and that the system as a whole has plenty of performance power to easily handle any containers and apps that you'd like to run on it. TOS 6 is a remarkable improvement from the last time I looked at a Terramaster NAS. I remember the last version, I get random pop-ups in Chinese, and the whole thing just felt cheap. This time, TOS is smooth, easy to use, and is finally not trying to be a Synology NAS, and I find that refreshing. Hardware-wise, the combination of the modern CPU, DDR5 RAM, and 10 gig networking makes this NAS a great platform for TOS 6 or hell, even TrueNAS if you want to install it on there. Now, let's talk about the not so good. Hardware performance aside, the F4-424 Max is expensive at $900 US just for the box, and that is only going to get you the 4 bays. I'd feel better about the price if the unit wasn't so plasticky feeling. You remember the Ugreen DXP 4800 Plus that we reviewed a while back? That entire NAS was made out of aluminum and it felt seriously premium, and it was roughly half the cost. Now, don't get me wrong, the F4-424 Max has much better internal hardware than the Ugreen NAS, so it's fair to say that Terramaster put the money into the internals over the externals, but really though, it feels a little cheap. Also, Terramaster makes mention of how this NAS excels at virtualization, but outside of VirtualBox as an installable app, there's nothing to really imply that this NAS has much in the way of virtualization duties. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the odd performance experience I had with the straight NVMe share. I'll be honest, I'm not sure where the hang-up lies in that. Could be the NAS, could be my NVMe's, but if you have a mirrored pair of NVMe's, you should be able to pull at full 10 gig speeds from the NAS easily. All of that being said though, this is the first Terramaster NAS that I wouldn't feel bad about owning. They're making fantastic progress on the OS, and the hardware is sound, and it's one of the few NASes on the market that you can install something else on, so if TOS isn't your thing, throw on Unraid or TrueNAS and call it a day. And that, friends, will do it for this video. If you liked it, throw us a sub and a like, and if you have a beef with anything I've said here, let me know in the comments below. Special thank you to our YouTube members. You guys help keep the lights on, and we thank you for it. If you'd like to help support the channel, consider becoming a member or buy some of our swag. It'll help us keep making these videos. And now that you've finished watching this video, how about checking out this playlist over here of other great hardware reviews we've done in the past? If you're looking for your next great piece of hardware, we can help.